Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm here joined with Egyptologist Falk, talking about Exodus. As you know, we just did a three-part series on Exodus called Exodus Rediscovered. After we launched the first one, Dr. Falk and I did a hangout talking about arguments for the early date of the Exodus and why those failed, why it's better to argue for the late date, which is in the 13th century. That went so well that a lot of people requested I have Dr. Falk back on to talk about objections to the overall Exodus, not from the early date side, because a lot of Christians take that, but from the other side, the skeptical side, the atheist side. So I'm happy to have Dr. Falk back. How are you doing today?
Doing excellent. How are you?
Wonderful, wonderful. For those who don't know, Dr. Falk has his own YouTube channel, Ancient Egypt in the Bible. It is linked in the description below. Be sure to go subscribe. He's got a lot of great content, a lot of good stuff coming up. And so with that, we're going to dive into some questions here. So I've got 7 questions for Dr. Falk that we talked about beforehand. And then we're going to go to, after that, we'll go to do some Q&A for a little bit until Dr. Falk is exhausted and needs a nap.
Which is right about now.
Yeah, understandable. So we released a 3-part series. We just released the one on the Conquest. But going back to first one, Exodus Rediscovered, where we talk about how the evidence of the Exodus is. The moment I uploaded that, I got so many messages from people saying, well, you mentioned in the documentary that the oldest son of Ramses II died unexpectedly. But I went to Wikipedia, and it says he died from head trauma. Now, I know you've answered this like numerous times on your channel in it seems like it comes up in almost every one of your own live streams. Like you keep having answered this, but really quickly, just answer this for us. So maybe you can finally be put to rest. Was Ramses II's oldest son, was he killed in a battle with head trauma? What happened to him?
We don't know. That's the quick answer. The long answer is this. When Kent Weeks did the excavations at KV5, now this is the massive tomb in the Valley of the Kings for the sons and daughters of Ramses II. He found in a shallow pit a pile of bones. Not mummies, bones. Okay? The bones of 4 individuals. And they're a jumble of bones. And they're not complete skeletons. But among this pile of bones is the skull of an individual who was about 20 years old who had a head injury. Okay? Now, at the time it was discovered, the excavation team, published this tentative, basically, press release with a lot of wiggle room in it. Essentially, basically saying this could possibly be the skull of Amenhotep, firstborn of Ramses II. Now, there are problems with that identification. A lot of problems with it. First of all, because it's not a mummy and just a skull, we don't know to whom it actually belongs. Ramses II had 52 sons. We also know, because of Ramses II's really long reign of 66 years, that more than one son predeceased him. Of course, the most famous one here is Amenhotep, who dies in his mid-20s. However, we also know that his first 12 sons predeceased him. Okay? We don't know what order they predeceased him. We also don't know when in time they predeceased him. So it is conceivable that one of Amenhotep's younger brothers could have had a head injury. It's also possible that these are not the bones of the sons of Ramses II at all. We do find cases in, say, tombs, even in the Valley of the Kings, where mummies get moved around for looting purposes. We also find that, like in the late and Ptolemaic period, ordinary people were burying their dead in those tombs. Like, for example, we find in the tomb of Queen Akhmosa Nefertari several individuals buried there. that have no relation to the queen. They were just, here's an empty tomb, stuff our dead aunt and uncle in there. And those were, Ptolemaic and late period burials. So we don't know the origin of the skull at all.
So it's kind of a conjecture.
It's really a conjecture, yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think you mentioned before also, I mean, peace with the Hittites happened before his son died, correct? So
yes.
It doesn't really seem like it lines well with the timeline in terms of when his son would have died.
Yeah, the peace treaty was negotiated and probably ratified around year 22. Mm-hmm. Okay? And then he dies around year 25. So hostilities between the Hittites had already ceased at that point. Really, they had already ceased by around the last campaign of Ramses II was in his 17th year. So there were really no more battles after the 17th year.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So let's. So it doesn't really seem like it is Amarkos. How do you say his name again?
Amun-Hir-Kopshef.
Amun-Hir-Kopshef. Yeah, I always feel like I'm not the best at pronunciation when it comes to Egypt.
Egyptian names are hard.
Yeah. So I also hear a lot of atheists use this argument a lot. There was a guy named John Van Seters, and he argued that toponyms like Pithom and Sukkoth, they match better with a 6th century BCE.
Okay.
P. Ramesses was referenced in the 10th century BCE. So what he was trying to argue is maybe the toponyms, which you have argued actually fit better with the 13th century BCE. Mm-hmm. So the toponyms in the book of Exodus, guys, Ramesses, Baal-Zephon, Pithom, Dr. Falk has argued that they fit really well with the geography of the 13th century. John Van Seters argues, no, they fit better with later, like the 6th century, and arguing that maybe this was when the Exodus account was being written, and it's sort of like a late myth that's being projected back on the past. How do you respond to this? Do you think they fit better with the 13th century?
Well, they do fit better with the 13th century. But let's trace Van Seters' argument here. Okay. Now, he doesn't have an argument really for Sukkoth or for Pi-Ramses, because Sukkoth comes from the Egyptian Cheku, which is not only the name of the Wadi Tumalot, but it's also the name of its capital city up until the 13th century. So it's a really old toponym. It goes back to the Middle Kingdom at least. We find it on the Whitechapel of Senwosret I, who's a Middle Kingdom king. So that's 20th century BC. Okay. Pi-Ramses, it was founded by Seti I. That's 13th century right there. And it ceases to be a capital city around 1080. So in the early 11th century. So, okay, now that's definitely in that 13th century ballpark. The Van Seters argument here really revolves around Pithom. Okay, that's really where it gets its impetus. Van Seters has basically said, okay, we've identified Pithom as Tel El Maskuta. Back in the early 20th century, Edward Neville found a stela at Tel El Maskuta saying, identifying the place as Pithom. And when he did the excavations there, we don't find anything below, say, older than the 7th century BC. And Van Seters says, aha, Pithom only dates back to the 7th century BC. Okay? Now, that's, a lot of people have confirmed that finding. Such as the project that later went to the Wadi Tumalot from the University of Toronto. They went back to Tel El Maskuta and said, yep, absolutely, 7th century, don't find anything more at Tel El Maskuta. Okay? Well, the problem here is that there was a Czechoslovakian consortium concession that excavated at nearby Tel El Rataba. And at Tel El Rataba, they found these collections of Ramesside statues. A collection of statues of Ramses II. And in 2018, they discovered that 2 of these statues have the name Pithom on them, per Atum, accompanying the Temple of Atum at Tel El Rataba.
Mm.
So what's going on here is that, and of course, Ramses II, 13th century. What happened was that at Tel El Rataba, that's the original Pithom. And what happened is, during the 7th century, the site and its name moved from Tel El Rataba to Tel El Maskuta.
Interesting.
So we have really solid evidence now to show that Tel El Rataba is the original Pithom.
Right. I also want to add that P. Ramesses, at least it doesn't go past 10th century BCE. So
no, it doesn't.
Moving up to the 6th century is quite a conjecture.
It is quite a conjecture, yeah.
Yeah.
But you can't say that it's a better fit for the 6th century.
Right. And I think
even
they made that well.
Yeah, even if you sort of did go that way, you're still going to have to deal with those lesser towns that we have no record of after, say, the Ramesside period.
Right.
Baal Zephon, Pi-Hahirot. We have Ramesside documents for those towns.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah. And so it just seems like can't just hark on this one Pithom toponym when all the other ones are pointing to the 13th century.
Yeah. And the Pithom toponym doesn't help them in any way.
Yeah. It's just unfortunate. I've seen a lot of skeptics arguing against the Exodus using that argument that the toponyms fit better with the 6th century. So that's why I wanted you to address that for sure.
Yeah.
And I thought your argument was spot on. I think he also has argued that it seems weird that the Exodus account calls P. Ramesses a store city. P. Ramesses was the capital city. Does that seem like it's out of place? Like maybe the authors of Exodus are wrong there?
Pithom wasn't a capital city either. I mean, it was essentially a capital of a nome. But it's using, like, if you look at Exodus 1:11, it's basically combining those 2 cities and treating them equal. Now, the point of Exodus 1:11 is not to showcase the grandeur of Ramses. That's not the point. The point of that passage is to show what did the Israelites build. Because you look at the passage and it says they built, the direct object is Pithom and Ramses, storage cities for Pharaoh. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's what the text reads literally. So it's not telling you that they're building the entire city. They're building the storage cities. It's kind of like saying, oh, my contracting firm, we built the landfill in New York. We built New York.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, you built the landfill at New York.
Right. Yeah, I think that's
storage cities are not the city itself.
Right.
They're actually a subdivision, a subset of the city. And what these are storage magazines. And you see dozens and dozens and dozens of these if you go to, say, Luxor, to the Ramesseum, the funerary temple of Ramses II. You'll just see, acres and acres of these mud brick storage magazines. And they're built surrounding a temple. The purpose of these storage magazines is to store up food to perpetuate offerings to the various gods and kings. The reason why is because kings didn't have... There wasn't a currency in ancient Egypt. It was a barter economy. Mm-hmm. So for a king to store up sacrifices for his cults to continue after he's dead, he had to store up food. So they made just an incredible amount of these storage magazines. And you can see them all across Egypt.
Awesome. So let's talk more about the conquest now. I got 2 questions from minimalists. Mm-hmm. that argue against the conquest, and I got 2 questions from your favorite group, the early date proponents. That try to argue.
They love me so much.
They do.
I feel so loved.
Yeah, the early date I try to argue that the conquest happened in the 1400s, and that's just riddled with problems. If you want, I link below Dr. Falk and I's first hangout where we discuss a lot of the problems with that. And I watched some early date proponents try to respond to that hangout, just fall all over themselves trying to do that. But anyway, I want to talk about Gezer. So I was reading recently in Biblical Archaeology Review. This came in. It talks about how the pharaoh Merneptah sacked Gezer around 1200, just before he made the Merneptah Stele of 1208. Okay, so if Gezer was able to be sacked by Merneptah, he was able to take an army all the way up into Canaan and sack Gezer. Shouldn't that at least show us that Egypt had a lot of military power? They were able to travel all the way up there, sack. That should have been able to prevent an Israelite conquest from happening, surely. So maybe Joshua's conquest is a myth, right? Because I think I remember even this was similar to an argument Holy Kool-Aid made that you responded to, that Egypt had so much military might in Canaan, there would never been able to have a conquest actually occur. And surely the recent excavations at Gezer show that. They show that Merneptah was strong enough to travel up there and cause to deal with rebels and the like. What do you say about that?
What I say about that is he's so strong he can take Gezer, but not strong enough to keep out the Libyans.
Yeah. For those who don't know.
Because the Libyan conquest takes place after Gezer.
So for those who don't know, the Libyans, I talked about in Exodus Rediscovered, but the Libyans actually invade from the east and they get all the way to the Nile before they're repelled. So,
yeah, they get to Heliopolis.
Yeah.
They get to that's like a hop, skip, and a jump to Memphis.
Yeah.
Memphis is the administrative capital of Egypt. That's where the bureaucracy is. Heliopolis is one of the most important cities in Egypt. It's now like a northwest suburb of Cairo, but you can understand why it's important. It's where the river forks. Okay? So, we don't know the exact date of the conquest into Canaan, but it's in the first 4 years of the reign of Merneptah. That's when he does his campaign into Canaan. The Libyan invasion is year 5. So he's strong enough to sack Gezer, but not strong enough to mount an immediate response against the Libyans. He's also not strong enough to drive out the Philistines, who have now a firm control of the coastal plain. Yes, he attacks Ashkelon. He attacks probably Gaza. But he isn't strong enough to really go far. Now, there's something really hinky too about the poetical portion about this of his Libyan victory stele, is that he goes up the coastal plain. Okay, that's not normal for an Egyptian king. But then he sort of comes back down into the Shephelah. Now, the Shephelah, for those who don't know, the geography of Palestine, you've got the coastal plain, then a swamp, and then it starts going up into Judean foothills. Between that swamp and the Judean foothills is an agricultural valley called the Shephelah. Gezer is in the Shephelah. So he's coming probably down that Shephelah and probably sacking some of those basically farming towns. So, that's a kind of an odd place to sort of strike if that's where you want to get your glory. He's not going after Megiddo. He's not going after Hatzor. Presumably it's still standing at that point. He's going after Gezer. That's his Gezer and Yenoam. Where's Yenoam? What sort of town was Yenoam? And yet, this is what he's saying is his big accomplishments on that poetical portion. Now, what's interesting about that poetical portion of the Merneptah Stele is that it's in couplets, okay? And the way the poetry works in those couplets is it basically takes two like things and compares them together. Libyans compared to the Hittites. Okay, conquers the Libyans, Hittites are at peace. He takes Ashkelon and he takes Canaan, which is actually a synonym for Gaza. Two cities on the coastal plain. Then Yenoam and Gezer. Those are two cities roughly in Judean foothills, Shephelah. Okay. The comparison he makes to Israel is to a wandering tribal people called the Kuru, or which we know as the Hurrians. Basically, the nomadic remnants of the Mitanni Empire. So you've got one wandering tribal group of people being compared to another wandering group of tribal people, the Israelites. So he's not knocking out Israelite cities. He has an encounter within the Israelite people. Now, we compare this to the timing of the Israelite conquest. Okay? Let's give the benefit of the doubt that they do the full 40 years in the wilderness. Okay? After the Exodus, it's pretty much 41 years. Later, Ramses II dies. Okay? Then, in the next 4 years, sometimes, Merneptah goes on campaign. We know that there are 3 phases to the Israelite conquest. That early 5-year phase, where they conquer, the big tough nuts. Hatzor, Jericho, Bethel and Ai, the Heshbon. These are the tough nuts that they have to crack as a unified people. Then they go to Shiloh and they argue for a year or so and divide up the land. Okay? And then each tribe has to go out and secure its own inheritance. Well, by the time they're finished arguing, 7 years have passed. Okay? This might not be that Merneptah was... the fact, whether or not he might have been able to stop the Israelite conquest may be irrelevant, because he might not have had the opportunity to stop them, because they were physically not in the same place. Mm-hmm. If Merneptah is going down the Shephelah Valley, or sticking to sort of the west side of the Judean foothills, and the Israelites are off in Shiloh, or basically up north, doing some other escapades, they might not have been at the same place at the same time.
Right.
And the encounter we see in the Merneptah Stele is basically just one of the outlying groups that encounters Merneptah. Mm-hmm. So it may just be a lack of opportunity.
Yeah. I also want to add in the article, they say this. I think they say about the whole sack of Gezer. They say, we know from excavations that in the final days of Ramses II's rule, the Egyptian governor's estate at Ephek, as well as in the administrative center at Jaffa, were violently destroyed. Some scholars attribute these destructions to the Canaanite king of Gezer, who might have sought to take advantage of Egypt's perceived weakness during the waning years of Ramses II's reign. So they're noting there is already Egyptian weakness happening in Canaan. It's not this idea they had this strong military presence and they could topple anyone. There is already weakness happening at the end of Ramses II's reign.
Yeah, we have to remember that it's during the reign of Ramses II that the Philistines get their foothold in the coastal plain. That's when they start taking towns. And we already see this in the monuments of Ramses II, where tribes of Philistines have basically supplanted the local Canaanite rulers.
Yeah, very good point. So another argument I want to bring is that skeptics always bring this up when we talk about the Israelite conquest. They bring up William Dever and Israel Finkelstein all the time. It's almost like these two guys have the final word on the Exodus and conquest. You cannot challenge them. End of story. Whatever they said is dogma. But they argue that the population growth that happened in Canaan around the same time as Joshua's conquest was because of local changes in population. Cities were being destroyed and people were retreating to the highlands. They formed the nation of Israel. This was not a conquest, people coming in from Egypt. This was changes within Canaan. And skeptics bring them up all the time. In the documentary, we talked about how Kenneth Kitchen responded to them a little bit, but I want you to try to add to that a little bit more. Talk about their arguments, why they're wrong, why a conquest makes far more sense.
Okay. First of all, one of the things we have to kind of understand is both Bill Deaver and Israel Finkelstein. Yeah, he admits this too. Okay, he admits this too, that in the 12th century, late 13th, we do see the beginnings of Israelite culture. That's agreed. Everyone agrees on that, pretty much. Deaver, Finkelstein, maximalists, across the board, they all agree on that. Okay? The question is going to basically boil down to what is the origin of those Israelites. Okay? Now, you're going to get some people who are going to go off the sort of the edge and say, well, those aren't the same Israelites as later Israelites, but, that's a bogus argument. But Israel Finkelstein and Deaver both agree that those are Israelites. But they're gonna say, hey, it's the 13th century, it's the 13th, 12th century where we start seeing this. Okay? Now, in the case of Finkelstein, he is going to basically say that, it cannot be from an Exodus, because the idea of an Exodus is incredulous. Now, you read his Israel Unearthed, his argument for this is really quite interesting, which is, he says, well, you cannot imagine that the Israelites coming out of Egypt would breach the tough defenses of Egypt and then basically travel north along the north coast of the Sinai, fighting Ketem fortress to Ketem fortress. There's this heavily fortified road along the north of Sinai to reach Israel. Well, okay, you think about that a little. Yes, it might make sense at some level, but then you go, hey, wait, that's not what the Bible says they did. It says they exited via the Wadi Tumilat. There they leave by Pithom. Pithom's in the Wadi Tumilat. There's only one Ketem fortress there. And that's the city of Pithom. But Pithom had a massive Semitic population. It was massively Semitic. It was friendly territory. Essentially, the Israelites chose that path to pick up people along the way. And that wouldn't have meant any meaningful resistance. Okay, so they go out into the basically the wilderness of Pithom at that point. Now, it tells us that they go north towards Migdol. Okay, and that's that along that border fortress. Okay. And that's where the Reed Sea event happens. But afterwards, they go south. They don't keep going along that northern road. After the Reed Sea, they turn south and cross at Refuting, which is the Wadi Faran. That's in the middle of the Sinai. There's no Egyptian forts there. There's no resistance there. There's nothing preventing them from wandering the Sinai after that. In fact, we even find a verse that says that the Israelites were not supposed to go along the way of the Philistines. Mm-hmm. For they would encounter battle, become afraid, and turn back. So they explicitly don't take that northern route. We would know this anyway because that northern route leads into the coastal plain. They don't come into the coastal plain. They go around the back end. They go up the back end, past Edom, Moab, and then cross into the north at Heshbon and Jericho. They come from the east. So they do this big circle around. So, Finkelstein's, reasons for saying that the Exodus is incredulous here just don't hold water.
Mhm.
But that's the reason they're not. And both, Finkelstein and Deaver were raised in a religious tradition. Deaver was raised as an evangelical fundamentalist. So he's got that sort of that mindset of, 1400 BC, that's the Exodus.
Mm-hmm.
Finkelstein was raised as an Orthodox Jew. He's also got that 1400 BC Exodus as a mindset as well.
Interesting. Yeah.
They're both have that vision, that sort of that training that's almost a caricature of the Exodus. So for them, it is incredulous.
In the documentary we mentioned, there was a whole big population explosion that happened around 1200. They try to argue that maybe some earlier Israelite villages, like 35 or so, showed up about a century earlier, like at the beginning of the 13th century BCE, before the Exodus would have happened. Is that true, or are these villages dating them as a little bit,
Well, it's very tricky to date these things. Okay.
Right. That's what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, it's very tricky to date these things. And we usually, even with the dates we have, say plus or minus 50 years here. Mm-hmm. Because the material culture isn't a quick transition. They're occupying these cities. They're using their houses. They're not destroying these cities. They're moving in. Mm-hmm. And basically they move into Canaanite houses, eat off of Canaanite cutlery and pottery. They're eating Canaanite grapes. They're just moving in and making themselves at home. So because of that, they're using the stuff that's there for as long as they can. Mm-hmm. So we do see that some of that transition gets kind of shady. It's kind of difficult to say because the transition isn't a clean cut. Now we'll see, say, like in the 1150s, we'll already see kosher bones in bone piles already. Okay, but as far as the ceramic culture, that's a slower transition. That's a slower transition because we do see that they're using the native implements for as long as they can.
Right. And I thought this was a good argument. The skeptical argument makes no sense. Why resettle yourself under a different name and a different god? Why make up the Exodus and the prophet Moses? And they're referencing the fact that if you're just a bunch of local Canaanites moving into the hill country, why make up this elaborate story of an Exodus? Choose a whole entirely different god.
If you're a Canaanite, use Baal. They're all worshiping Baal already.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just a weird thing to make.
Why stop eating pig? Bacon's good.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's what we noticed in the Conquest video. Around the same time of the population explosion, pig bones just seem to disappear from the Judean islands.
I mean, this came up as an objection on my channel. Why would the Israelites, pick up the Semitic custom of not eating pork? It's not a Semitic custom. It's an Egyptian custom. Prior to the Israelites moving to Canaan, they were all eating pork in Canaan. It was the Egyptians that didn't eat pork. Mm-hmm. And they didn't eat pork because pig farming fouled up the waterways.
Interesting.
So the sons of Israel, they're bringing that custom of not eating pork with them into Canaan. It's not a Canaanite custom. It's an Egyptian custom.
Yeah, it just seems like everything lines up. Avaris abandons. 40 years or so later, you have the population explosion, and there's all these Egyptian customs tied to the Exodus, that being one of them. It's all very interesting. So, it just, I don't know. I don't know why skeptics cling to Deaver and Finkelstein so much, and this idea that it was this Canaanite.
Well, Deaver's changed his thinking a lot, too. I mean, he's not as minimalist as, say, Finkelstein is.
Interesting.
And Finkelstein has he's had some difficulties trying to maintain his minimalism, as the shovel turns. Yeah, I think that's important to point out as well. So let's talk about some arguments
against the late date for the conquest from the early date proponents.
Okay.
As we know, Scott Stripling has been doing his thing lately on Mount Ebal, talking about it constantly. He has been arguing that at the Mount Ebal site there is the rectangular altar, which dates to the 1200s, 13th century. But he says there's a circular one underneath it, and he's arguing that should date to 1400 BC. And a lot of people have said this to me, like, well, this could push the Exodus further back because there's another altar underneath it and a separate layer, right? Shouldn't that also mean that the conquest was earlier?
Okay, well, the Stripling's organization, Associates for Biblical Research, and the organizers of the excavation at Mount Ebal have a strained relationship. Okay, there's a strained relationship there. Adam Zertel, who spearheaded that excavation and had the concession, he needed cheap labor, and he needed a way to fund the excavation, and basically found ABR to help them out. Okay? But the two are at loggerheads when it comes to actually interpreting the material. Okay? Now, Zertel will date the square altar to the late 11th century. Okay, late 11th or early 11th, late 12th century. He'll date the round altar to the late 13th, early 12th. So they're 50 years apart. They're 50 years apart according to Zertel. Now, where does Stripling get the date? I should say two. There's these altars have been dated using two methods. Okay, ceramic typology and a pair of scarabs that were found there. Now, ceramic typology does not help Stripling's case. All the potsherds, without exception, at Mount Ebal date to late Bronze 2B, early Iron Age 1. That's around your 1200, 1100 BC. Okay? So that's no help to him. That and you know, he has to kind of say, okay, maybe there wasn't any pots happening. Okay. But it's the two scarabs. The two scarabs here are what's really sort of the thing. Now, one scarab has the name Ramses II on it. And it is unquestionably in a Dynasty 19 style. Okay? So, it's the second scarab that's become the bit of the issue. It's got the name Tutmosis III on it. And Scott Stripling goes, we got a Tutmosis III scarab. You know, we can now date that circular altar to the 15th century. There's our early conquest. Well, there's a little detail that he's left out here. That detail is that scarab is in a 19th dynasty style. Scarabs have styles of carving. Just like we see, for example, styles of clothing or furniture. You can date clothing and furniture by their style. You can also date scarabs by their style. Think of it this way. It's like finding an iPhone with a sticker of Elvis on it, and then dating the iPhone by the sticker. Whole lot of love going on.
Yeah, not how it works.
No, it's not how it works. And it doesn't work for scarabs either. It's not enough to date it by the name. You also have to date it by the style. And if you look at all the archaeological reports for Mount Ebal, they will all tell you that Tutmosis III scarab is in the Dynasty 19 style.
Yeah.
So it'd be anachronistic to date it to the 15th century.
It seems only ABR is trying to argue Ebal can go back to 14.
Yeah, it is only ABR who's arguing this. Because they've got a vested interest. This is a take all proposition for them. Okay, this is their If they lose this, they lose it all.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Because if it proves that Mount Ebal is a late Bronze 2B site and not a late Bronze 1A, 1B site, then their hope of an early conquest is shot. If the hope for an early conquest is shot, an early date of an Exodus is also shot. So it's a winner-take-all proposition for them.
And if you guys go to
they have to win this.
If you go to the video description, Dr. Falk has already addressed a lot of their other arguments they use for early date, like the Shashu inscription, the Amarna tablets. They're arguing from the dating of the biblical texts. A lot of problems with that. Everything points more to the late date by far and large, and especially if you just watch Exodus Rediscovered Conquest, you'll see that the population does not change in Canaan around 1400 like it does around 1200. So
it's cherry picking the data.
Yeah, very much.
It's cherry picking the data. It's picking out the pieces of data you like and ignoring the pieces of data you don't like. And that, of course, leads you to confirmation bias.
Exactly. We're going to go to Q&A soon, so get your super chats in. We'll answer them for a little while here. But I have one more question for Dr. Falk while you're getting them in. So any super chats that come in, we will answer them. So go ahead and send them in if you'd like them. But before we get while that's happening, question for you. Any update on the Mount Ebal curse tablet? As we know, about a couple months ago, ABR announced that they had found this tiny little curse tablet in the up on Mount Ebal, and they claim it said that cursed by the god Yahweh. If it's true, it'd be the earliest inscription for the mentioning Yahweh. So any update on that? Anything we should know about that?
Yes. There has been developments. We still don't have access to the raw data. We don't know when we'll ever get access to the raw data. Okay? I'm hoping they're not going to pull a Steve Collins. And essentially, we're not going to give you the raw data unless you agree with us. Okay? So, which is why we never got the raw data for Tel El Hammam. Is because unless you agree with them, you don't get it.
Yeah, and I just thinking on that one, but that does not seem like it's checking out now.
No, it's not checking out. So we don't know when we're going to get the raw data. Okay. However, one of the translators, Gershon Galil, just this week proposed, basically translated another stela from the late Bronze 2B site at Jerusalem. Now, this one is even more hinky, but it has a translation of a curse that's almost identical, strangely identical, to the Ebal amulet. Okay? Now, you look at the tablet, and there's a nice photograph of that Jerusalem tablet, and it looks like chisel marks. Just looks like chisel marks. It doesn't look like writing of any kind. Nothing I can identify as writing. Is this a case of pareidolia? Looking at the clouds and seeing a puppy in the clouds. It's possible that does happen to some epigraphers. But it puts into extreme doubt his methodology for transliteration, epigraphy, and translation. When I looked at the photos that I saw of the Ebal amulet, and I got a few insider photos, I could only make out two characters distinctly. An aleph and a resh. Okay? Now, I don't think anyone, argues that the Ebal amulet is a cursed amulet. It's made out of lead. These are very common during, say, the Hellenistic period and into the Common Era. But translating that, providing a translation of that, is a whole nother matter. Especially since it's been hammered flat. So, but but if Galil is right that the Jerusalem tablet is a bona fide translation, that puts serious doubts as to whether or not that Ebal tablet is distinctly Ebal amulet is distinctly Hebrew. Because late bronze, 2B Jerusalem, Jebusite time. That's a Jebusite kingdom. It was all the way to the time of King David. Okay? So, doesn't matter if you're early date or late date. Late bronze 2B Jerusalem is Jebusite. It's Canaanite. And the spelling, the epigraphy, the whole formula of that curse text in that Jerusalem tablet looks almost exactly the same as that Ebal amulet. So, if we can't tell any difference between the two, it puts serious doubts as to not just whether or not the Ebal amulet is distinctly Hebrew, but whether Galil and Peter van der Veen were reading anything at all. So I think there's some serious red flags here. Some serious red flags about that amulet and the Jerusalem tablet, honestly. That, I mean, even the Israeli Antiquities Authority has already put out a notice saying, exercise extreme caution before believing this. We're having our doubts.
Understandable, yeah.
And if they're putting out a press release saying we doubt this, they don't normally do that. Newspaper fines come and go. They very rarely put out something that says, "Hey, caution here." Caution. Red flag, red flag, red flag.
Yeah, well, luckily Douglas Petrovich has already said on Twitter that the Jerusalem inscription is Hebrew in a Jebusite kingdom, which...
Well, that's an amazing coincidence. Yeah, it's an amazing coincidence that we have a Hebrew inscription inside of a Jebusite city. I don't know how that works. How does that work? How does that work? I know Petrovich is not much of a historian, but you would have thought that he would at least realize that, well, Jerusalem was conquered by King David. It was the one city that the Judahites were not able to secure. Mm-hmm. They sack it briefly during the beginnings of the conquest, but they don't take it, they don't secure it. And the Jebusites rebuild. And it remains a solid fortification until King David. This is just basic biblical history.
Yeah, there's a lot. Just to let everyone know, there's a lot of red flags coming up about the Ebal curse inscription. Yeah. So
I would wait before using this as putting any stock in it. Let's wait to get the raw data.
Yeah, and that's why
let's have a look
out of Exodus Rediscovered entirely, because we don't have the data yet.
Yeah.
So we're gonna go to Q&A. So if anyone wants to send any super chats in, we'll answer them right away. We have a question here. Has Lorenzo Nagro's research made any impact on biblical scholarship? Is Joshua still seen as an historical figure? I mean, a lot of people doubt, or is Joshua still seen as historical fiction? My mistake.
Okay, the whole thing with Lorenzo Nigro. Lorenzo Nigro is very sheepish about this. He's being bullish. I mean, he's being sheepish. He doesn't like to admit this. First of all, he's fully aware of Garstang's second destruction layer. Mm-hmm. He's aware of his second late bronze destruction layer. And he's aware of the fact that the late bronze one occupation at Jericho did not produce a destruction layer. Okay? But the late bronze 2 particularly, layer had been wiped away through site leveling. And when he's asked, he goes, his audience is either smart enough well read enough on the literature, or they aren't. And he's happy either way. If they're not well read on the literature, he's happy with them being oblivious. If they are red enough, he'll just go, well, draw your own conclusions. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So he's very bullish about this. Very bullish. Now he has made some. His discoveries at Jericho have reopened the door to the possibility of a historical Joshua. There's no question about it. They've also opened the door of some of these other late bronze sites, or these sites where we don't find late bronze layers. Because that's one of the things that's sort of ubiquitous in, say, the region, is we don't find a lot of late bronze layers across the Judean foothills. That's very odd right there. We'll find, say, potsherds from late bronze period, but not necessarily the whole layer. How much site leveling was being done elsewhere? How often were these sites being sort of re-leveled for construction, and particularly Israelite construction?
For those who don't know, we talked about it in the Conquest video, is that there was evidence of site leveling that happened at Jericho. So later builders cut in to the late Bronze Age layers, sort of removing them. So it's not that we don't find evidence of destruction, it's that we find those layers have been tampered with. So that's the problem there. But he did find some evidence that does correspond to the biblical account. It's just we need to do more research there, which would be very nice. Yeah,
he did find a portion of a mud brick wall. Mm-hmm. And that's very encouraging, because if there's one brick wall, there's probably a second one somewhere. You know, because one didn't just put up a single mud brick wall because they weren't that strong. You made them into a casemate design.
So, quick question. I think this one is for me. Anything about Judges rediscovered? I don't know if I'll call it that. I think I'm just going to stick with the Exodus thing. I'll probably just do something on biblical archaeology for Judges eventually. I got to go through a bunch of books and excavation reports first, tally up the data, see what I can get to, go through Kitchen's book again. But yeah, that should, that's probably a little far off. I'm going to do some stuff on the documentary hypothesis first, do some videos on eschatology, and circle back to archaeology eventually. Let's see, here we have another question here. What is the time frame from the Israelites leaving Avaris and the Merneptah Stele first being built? Would this time be enough for Merneptah to know of Israel?
Yeah, absolutely. The fact is that once the Exodus happens around 1265, they want around 40 years, so they're entering around 1225. And the year later, Merneptah comes to the throne. And then 5 years from then, he does his campaign against the Libyans. Okay? So, you know, all it would take for him is to encounter one tribe in the Levant that says, hey, we're Israelites, we're not Hurrians, and he would know about them. Because, you know, they didn't kill everyone. They took survivors. They took slaves. They did take captives. And they would interrogate them. Just like any captive. You know, we do actually have instances where a false prisoners are sent by opposing armies to be taken as captives. So when they are interrogated, they give false information. And we have actually Egyptian papyri that record some of these instances where they've encountered people that they've captured that were there planted to give the Egyptians false information.
Interesting. So, next question. This one should be a short one, I think. Merneptah only reigned for about 10 years. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, good. Here's another question. This one's a little bit unrelated, but it is still interesting. Genesis 5, meaning in order from Adam to Noah, means man appointed mortal sorrow, and yet the blessed God shall come down, teaching his death shall bring the despairing rest and comfort. Have you heard this theory?
No. I wouldn't place much stock in this.
Yeah, it's the argument that the names meaning.
Yeah, the names mean something. And essentially you're reading the names to get another message.
Yeah. I would say if you guys No, there was a book written by Richard Hess called Israelite Religions. He's got a section on these names, and he points out we don't know the meaning of a lot of these names. For example, we know that Adam is man, but we don't know if Seth actually means appointed. Enosh actually just means man as well. It's not mortal. Whoever came up with this theory just saw that it meant man and then returned it into mortal because that would make it an adjective, so they fit with the theory. So check out Richard Hess's book. This is not a good argument. Please don't use this. Here we got a super chat coming in. Super chats go to the front of the line. Does Dr. Falk have an opinion on the population per acre of ancient towns? If you know that.
Yes. We do know, for example, the population density in Egypt of, say, Semitic villages. And I think it's around 800 per hectare, but I'd have to probably look it up. Especially at the town of Kahun, which was a Semitic village in the near the Fayoum, by the Middle Kingdom capital of Ichitawe. So we do have a pretty good idea of what the population density was at that time.
So just so you guys know, Dr. Falk does live streams on his channel weekly. So if you have a question, subscribe to his channel, tune in for one of the live streams, and you can ask him. He goes through a lot of questions. I've sent people there. So be sure to go and make sure you subscribe. And if you have any questions that are going to come up later, you can always ask him during these weekly live streams that he does. So another question I have here for you. Have you guys talked about the census numbers yet?
I don't know. Have we talked about the census numbers yet?
I mentioned it briefly. In Exodus Rediscovered that Mitchell Medine, I believe, argued they're very symbolic. These are not actual facts.
Well, I think. I mean, first of all, I think we are talking about here the groups of clans. You know, each tribe has a certain number of clans. I don't think it's thousands. I think what we're talking about here, because Israel is a clan-based society. That LF, I mean, we know that LF has a really broad range of meaning. It doesn't just mean thousand. It means army, contingent, division, clan even. It can even extend to clan. Okay? So, when I look at, say, the census numbers that we find in the Book of Numbers, both in, I think it's 2 and 25, they have two separate census. One at the beginning and one at the end. The remarkable thing is that the number of clans don't change. Fundamentally. And that's really to show that the clan structure had been preserved throughout the wandering period. Mm-hmm. So that's really part of the census numbers, is to really show clan integrity. It's really not to show the numbers of people. It's to show the clan integrity. That it was maintained even despite the fact that one generation completely died off and was replaced by another.
I think that's a good point. So we got a couple super chats that came in all at once. So I'm going to go through some of these here. Should the pork taboo have been begun with the law being given? Why was it before? Will you talk about so the second question, will you talk about the Davidic kingdom? How do you read a lot of the Old Testament? So a lot of questions here. I'll answer the last one. How do you read the Old Testament? You study it. You read scholars, read commentaries, follow scholars like Dr. Falk. That's why I changed my view in the early days, because scholars corrected me. That's the way you do that kind of thing. When you talk about the Davidic kingdom, Dr. Falk talks about that sometimes on his channel, on his Q&As. I'll eventually do a video on it in the future. I just haven't got around to it yet. Do you want to tackle the first two questions there?
Sure. Why was it taboo before? Again, we already touched on that. Pork farming pollutes waterways. All you have to do is walk by or drive by a pork farm in the United States, and it's a rank smell. Nothing smells worse than a pig farm. And if you're downstream from a pig farm, you are not a happy camper. Okay? It smells bad. There's no two ways about it. It just pollutes waterways. And because you had so many people in Egypt dependent upon canals for their water, going deep inland. If you had a pig farm upstream, that was not polite to your neighbors. Okay? So, the pork taboo is coming out of that environment. Now, when we talk about the giving of the law, we are not talking about something that is just done by a divine fiat. Okay? God is not just saying, okay, all of these laws are from scratch. You never heard of these laws before. You never had any of these customs before. What God is doing is basically saying, okay, this custom is good, continue doing that. This custom is bad, stop that. Okay? You're not eating pork already? Continue doing that. You're whoring around with your neighbor's wife? Stop doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not like all these things had to be given de novo. I mean,
No.
these things could have been drawing from the culture. God shows up. He works with the people where they're at and tries to bring them to a better place. Obviously,
lots of the priestly purification rituals are the same as the Egyptian priestly purification rituals. The ritual bathing, followed by the putting on of clean clothes, and avoiding wearing animal products when you go into a temple. Egyptians did the same thing. Now, there's some things the Israelites didn't do that the Egyptians did, like they didn't shave, they didn't wash out their mouth with natron. Now, some of that is the fact that beards were part of, say, the culture of Semitic culture. And to lose your beard as a man was part of, it was a sign of shame in a Semitic culture. So they didn't practice that. As far as washing out their mouth with natron, well, Israel does not have a supply of natron. So that would have been impractical in Canaan. Whereas in Egypt has lots of natron.
Interesting. So, thoughts on Sinai? Thank you for the super chat, Leonardo. Not sure what you mean. Anything on Sinai?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a savanna. It wasn't a desert. Some recent research I did on, say, the climate of Sinai has shown that by the time we get to the late Bronze Age, we have to remember, back in the Neolithic period, Sinai was covered with green fields and forests. Okay? Even the Sahara Desert was a savanna. Okay? During, say, the end of the Old Kingdom and the end of the Neolithic wet period, all that dries out. First the Sahara, then the Sinai. And what happens is, by the time of Moses, it's a savanna. It's not a desert at this point. It's not like the desert of today. We have to remember that the Israelites are still grazing their sheep in the Sinai. Midianites are still grazing their sheep in the Sinai. You wouldn't be grazing your sheep somewhere where there's nothing to eat. We actually have records of Bedouin from the Middle Kingdom. Okay, these are Middle Kingdom Egyptian records where Bedouin are grazing cattle in the Sinai. Okay? Cattle require water and silage, and a lot of it. Okay? If there's nothing to eat, there's no water, you're not grazing cattle. Okay? You're just not doing it. But by the time of, say, 700 years later, when you get to the time of Moses, you can't support cattle anymore in the Sinai. Isn't enough silage, there isn't enough water. So they have to go do sheep and goats instead. But there's still enough, grasslands, acacia trees, almond trees, to not only, say, graze their sheep, but they can also build things like the Ark of the Covenant and the Tabernacle as well.
Interesting. Awesome. Another question. Do you guys subscribe to pre-Adamism? I think this is the idea that humans existed before Adam. I do, following Heiser's argument on this. If you want, check out my Genesis 1 to 11 series. What about you, Dr. Falk? What is your view on pre-Adamism?
I don't comment on this.
Awesome. All right, moving on.
Look, my view on Origins is this. I'm staying out of that game.
That's a smart move. If you want
basically, I don't much care if you're young Earth creationist, old Earth creationist, progressive creationist, theistic evolutionist. I don't much care. Doesn't matter to me. I follow the scriptures. I do believe there was an Adam.
Me too.
Okay. I have certain opinions about Genesis and, say, the timing of events, but, I don't make a big deal of them, and basically I stay out of that game. There's nothing that compels me. I mean, here's one of the things. There is nothing that compels me to choose a scientific compatibilist point of view with the Bible. It's an ancient Near Eastern text. And I'm reading it as ancient Near Eastern text. And I'm not trying to compatibilize it.
Good, yeah. And again, if you want to know mine, just see my Genesis 1 to 11 series playlist on my channel. You'll get a lot of info there. This is a good question for me. Thank you for the super chat. Will you do a video on defending Daniel? Yes, eventually. There are so many topics I need to get to. Right now, again, I'm going to focus on documentary hypothesis. That's coming out next month. I'm going to focus on eschatology. I'm going to go back and do a little bit more on reliability of the Gospels because I've been reading a lot on that, wanting to come back. Then I'll come back and do more Old Testament stuff because Dr. Falk does a lot of great stuff on Old Testament. I've done some stuff on Old Testament that's almost as good as his stuff. But
you flatter me.
Of course I do. Well, you're on my channel. I have to be polite.
Oh, okay.
But,
I'm glad we've cleared that up.
Apologists do, or scholars and apologists do a lot of stuff on Old Testament. That's why I wanted to do more. That's why I did the Exodus series, because up to this point, there's not been a lot of good Exodus documentaries. We see things like Patterns of Evidence or Exodus Decoded, which are fringe, tinfoil hat theories. So I will do a lot more on Old Testament. I just got to circle around. But before I do Daniel, I want to do a video specifically on eschatology, because I think we have been misunderstanding prophecy. I think we misunderstand the ancient Near Eastern context of prophecy. And I'll just say this. I've been reading up some stuff that scholars note that prophecy was conditional. We tend to read prophecy almost like it's fatalism. There's a lot more we need to study with regards to prophecy before we can even get to the book of Daniel. So I'll leave that there. Here's a question. Thank you for the super chat. Wasn't the custom of time that if a nation's people conquered the surrounding area of a city, but not the city itself, then the conquerors would raise a stele in the city and tax them?
Well, we do have to remember that Egyptians did that. I mean, the Egyptians did that, but we have to remember that usually that came with the conquest of a city. Now, there's a difference between conquering a city and destroying it. The fact is that the Egyptians, they would conquer a city and then tax it. Because for them, they're trying to shore up 3,000 years of inflation. The Egyptians really weren't interested in empire. They weren't interested in empire. Empires are expensive. Okay? Egypt has a huge inflation problem, and Wolfgang Helck did a series of books where he chronicles the price of goods over time. And you can just see things getting progressively more and more and more expensive over time. One of the reasons why Khufu in the Dynasty 4 was able to make the Great Pyramid was because labor was so cheap. The kings of the Middle Kingdom couldn't make a pyramid like that anymore, and certainly not out of stone. They had to resort to mud brick and lots smaller. And it was just pure economics. But when you get to the New Kingdom, they can't even afford that anymore. That's why they start doing these rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings. It's economics. Things get so expensive. In fact, during, say, the time of Ramses III and Ramses IV, you've got hyperinflation. So much so, it causes instability in the kingdom. So they're using these hegemonic states like the Levant and like Nubia to shore up their economy. Bring more goods in to lower the price of everything. That's what they're doing here. This is why, say, for example, Egypt comes in to a place in Levant. They will surround it. They will say, hey, it's better off for you just to be taxed. Better off to be taxed. We can destroy your city if we want. We don't want to destroy your city. We want to tax you. And then we'll go away. And you can squabble with your neighbor all you want.
Sort of like
Which is exactly, it's exactly what happens in the Amar letters. Is Akhenaten is collecting tribute. and letting the little city-states in Canaan fight amongst each other. But that's because they're shoring up an economy. Now, later on, Assyrians and Babylonians are going to come in and they're going to set up empire. The Philistine cities are going to revolt against, say, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and the Babylonians are just going to destroy their cities as a punitive measure. Egyptians aren't doing that. They aren't doing that. They're not doing this for punitive reasons. They're not doing this to maintain control. They're doing this for economic reasons. So they want to take a light touch on everything.
Very, very well said. Thank you for the super sticker, Jamie. Appreciate that. Also, he also said, "I am the law." Awesome, man.
Sure.
Elijah B. Thank you for the very generous super chat here. Could the Israelites have understood the distinction between Yahweh and His glory, angel, spirit, etc., in the context of Egyptian theology and the concepts of gods having multiple parts like Ka and Ba that can act independently?
Well, it's hard to know exactly how they understood that. We do kind of get the impression that monotheism, the whole concept of monotheism, is actually coming out of, say, the Ten Commandments, the law. It's basically the first expression of transcendence that we find in Israelite theology. Where it says, God made the heavens and the earth, 6 days He worked, and then He rested from it. The idea is He's taking His rest outside of creation, apart from it. And once you got transcendence, and you combine that with monolatry, the idea that you can only worship one God, the whole artifice collapses into monotheism proper. So, when they're coming out of Egypt, they are understanding gods and, angels as basically other kinds of gods. Because in Egypt, Necheru, which is the Egyptian word for gods, applied to anything from their highest god Amun-Re down to some shadow they find in the corner of their rice bin, the grain bin. It's just any spirit was a Necher. They didn't have a separate word for angels or demons. They were all gods.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point because a lot of people try to argue the Old Testament teaches polytheism, and no, it teaches there's multiple Elohim, which just means any being in the spirit realm, according to my
It's monarchical monotheism is what it is.
Yeah,
and that's what it is. It's monarchical monotheism. The idea that there's one great, infinitely powerful God, and then all these other spirits that are much lesser. That they're not ontologically or by essence God, but they're more powerful than you. Or at least can make a mess of your day.
So Jamie says weekly Sabbath, plausible origin on Old Earth creationism. I know Dr. Falk wants to stay away from that. I'll just say, yes, if you take John Walton's view of Genesis 1, you can have a understanding of the weekly Sabbath just fine. You can see my Genesis series that does that as well. Super chat, just wanted to support the channel. Appreciate that. Thank you so much for the super chat. I did have one more question for you, and then we'll close everything out.
Okay.
Somebody had, where is this? This was earlier, but I saved it for you. Dr. Falk, well, there's no you in your name, but do you have a book, and where can I pick it up?
Yes, I do. I have a book. It's called The Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian Context and Illustrated Journey. Let's see if I can grab it here. All right. Oops. That's the cover.
There it is.
All right. Got my name at the bottom there. Okay. You can buy it at christianbooks.com. Amazon carries it. Even Walmart carries it. Hey, if your book's at Walmart, you've made it. It's a great book, even if I do say so myself.
It is a great book. I've read it. It is wonderful.
It has over 100 illustrations. Most of the photography is original. So that's all my photography for the most part. So I believe I have 99 photographs in there. So it's richly illustrated. It's a beautiful book. It's now, it was originally published by Hendrickson Publishers. It's now published by Tyndale House, and they did an excellent job printing. They just did a magnificent, beautiful, beautiful job of publishing it.
Interesting. Any future projects coming up? Anything you want to plug? Again, your channel linked in the video description, Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Subscribe. But go ahead.
Well, we would like to, at some point, do a book on the Exodus. Particularly with a focus on the plagues of Egypt. Okay? Now, we figure we'll also include evidence for the Exodus as well in that. So we want to start looking at that project. Now, we started getting a fundraiser going on this, but we still need more support in order to complete that project.
I will add that to the video description after the Hangout so people can go and donate to that as well. If you want to help support, get a good book on the Exodus, not, again, fringe stuff like Patterns of Evidence, then you want to support that as well.
It's that we need this. We need a good book on the Exodus. It's something that can be understood at a lay level.
Yeah, and I think that'd be absolutely wonderful for sure. We definitely need that. So with that, I'll close it out. I'll let you guys go again. Dr. Falk does live streams every week on his channel. If you go subscribe, you can tune into those, send a super chat in. And so if you have a question that come up later from watching this Hangout or from watching any of the Exodus Rediscovered videos, you can go there and ask him, and he will answer all your super chats. So with that, thanks everybody for coming. Check out the 3-part series of Exodus Rediscovered to get a whole list of the evidence, cover more objections there, try to give the best case for the Exodus out there. And Dr. Falk, thanks for coming on the channel today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
All right. See you guys next time.